Okay, so terrorism has many definitions actually. The United Nations has its own definition of terrorism, and the United States, of course, no, will have its own, or actually have its own definition of terrorism. But what is important regarding this several definitions is that they share um, common concerns, like terrorism is an act that attempted to create fear or attempted to create hostile reactions to people, and attempted to create confusions to people by providing, or by all this suggesting violence and destruction. Okay, so probably the way I interpret your question is that in relation to terrorism, what led to terrorism today, as in relation to the past. Uh, it's kind of interesting that there's no word terrorism in the past. I think it's a very very recent word that created to capture this phenomenon wherein political events lead to some chaos and destruction. So if you want to go back to history, I'm not an expert in terrorism, history of terrorism, but the way I interpret it is something like this: there were terroristic quote unquote acts in the past, but were never called terroristic act. It's only quite recently that we call them terrorism. For example, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines is not something that we call terroristic act, but because of the definition of the United States that we adopted, the Abu Sayyaf group becomes terrorist, and their acts become acts of terrorism. Acts of aggression, I think, is the best way to deal with that. And nations, Hitler, for example, in the past, Holocaust, if I think if the word terrorism already exists during that time, Holocaust will be called a form of terrorism, di ba? Yung persecution of the Jews, killing them in mass, destroying their properties, livelihood, even their citizenship. Okay, so your question about how is it related to political movement of the present?
No, socio-political events. How does socio-political events in history greatly influence the phenomenon of terrorism?
Okay, one is the globalization of technology. For example, things that happened in Croatia or things that happens in Kazakhstan suddenly becomes available to us in our television. So things that happen in the United States, for example, the 9/11 thing, it happened there, miles and miles, oceans apart from us, but suddenly becomes an evening news in the Philippines in just so short a time, right? So my point is that yung socio-political events are made connected by technological improvements, like technology, television, probably internet or cell phone, diba? And these technologies are being used by good forces and bad forces, terroristic and not, no? In pursuing their specific agenda. So your second part of the second question is about the
Examples.
examples of
In relation to the
Middle East.
yes, Middle East.
Okay, probably the best way to
Just one
the best
example, please.
yeah, I think the best example to invoke there is the what's the name of the leader of this terroristic group, Osama bin Laden, right? If you're going to recall, Osama bin Laden, the American people, or the America had a very difficult time locating Osama bin Laden, di ba? But only to find out it's just in one of the compounds near the intelligence quarter of Pakistan. He's just there around the bush, and he's around just in the corner, and he was able to run the entire Al Qaeda movement using specific. Have you seen how many USBs he had? Hundreds. He will be recording a message, have the USB transferred elsewhere in the world, and the USB will be played. So in that sense, terrorism is related to technological innovations. We can actually solve terrorism. In my own point of view, terrorism is something that you should not aspire to solve simply because it's not solvable at the moment. Terrorism is a form of ideology, or most terroristic acts are pursued within the guise of, an ideology. For example, the Muslim the Muslim notion of jihad, which is a holy war. They launch it not because they want to kill people. They launch it not because they want to destroy property. They launch it simply because they believe it is the moral, the most ethical thing to do, which has a counterpart in history, the Crusades, diba? It was launched by the Catholic Church in order to, bring back into the path the people who were led astray by the Muslim religion. So the Christian and the Muslim have their own versions of, quote unquote, attempts to terrorize people, crusades, and the notion of jihad. So why is it that we cannot solve them? It's a form of ideology. It's not something that you can fix overnight. Like, if you want to fix poverty, you give people jobs, right? But an ideology is something that you don't believe, something that you can compromise, right? So it cannot be solved, it can only be addressed. A form of dialogue, something like what Pinoy had done in signing this agreement. Remember that the last agreement that he had with our Muslim brothers, they were given a form of independence and autonomy to deal with the Muslim region.
Okay.
You cannot fight them. In Philippine history suggests that we cannot fight the Muslim. All we can do is what? Work with them. So you do not solve it, you dialogue with them. I think it's sa akin kasi it's more cultural no? What other factors that lead to extremism? I think it's cultural, and I cannot help but mention again the word political. It's a class of ideology. It's communism versus what? Communism against
Democratic.
no. Remember, most political movement in the Middle East are attempting to target nations that are autocratic, di ba? Mga dictatorship like Saddam Hussein's, Assad, right? Dami niyan. So, pero ang form of government nila is mostly monarchical saka dictatorial. Okay? So, it's a form of political struggle. So, if I'm going to answer your question, what are the other forces that led to extremism? I think the answer to that is mostly cultural and political. Why cultural? Most of this extremist group, or not necessarily members of the extremist group, probably the reason why people in the Middle East will have violent reactions, or will have what's the name of this and the word that I'm thinking about is why are they so excited changing the forms of their government? Okay, so it's a form of liberation. In a sense, it's not ideological but a form of liberation. They were able to go around, but in the past they can't go in other countries because they were not allowed to apply for passports. Okay, so democracy gives them the opportunity to become mobile and see the world again. Okay, so it's political and it's also cultural. The best way to answer that is this: most nations are like individuals. They agree on how to do it, what to do, and how to do it. Remember, we have these international treaties. The best example for that is when America is being threatened by terrorists. America classifies nations into two: enemies and friends. If you're not with us, you're against us. So one way to answer that concern is that sometimes attitudes of nations became the basis of whether you become friends or whether you become you become enemies.